Hello, my talk. I always wanted a little girl, a thematic network analysis of transgender children in horror films. Will cover some results of a thematic network analysis I've been conducting on horror films, feature films featuring transgender characters, focusing today specifically on cases in which the trans character is a child. Before going into that, however, I would like to provide some context to this research. This topic is part of my PhD, and broadly, I've been looking at transgender people's perspectives and relationship with the horror genre. My research has at its core the methodological but also political approach of centering real life transgender experiences, even when engaging in more detail focused textual analysis. When I started this research in 2022, I argued in my proposal for the timeliness of conducting research on fear and transness. It was a time of uncertainty and plausible deniabilities. I could not have imagined how quickly and swiftly my human rights as a trans person would have been attacked as I conducted this research. Around 2016, a movement of concerned parents advocating against trans people's access to healthcare started taking some shape in its organization and rhetoric through the online parenting forum Mumsnet, leading to the development of the expression rapid onset gender dysphoria. This refers to an alleged social contagion through which allegedly previously cisgender teenagers would suddenly experience gender dysphoria because of peer pressure. Despite the medical sounding name, this is an expression and proposed diagnosis with no scientific basis, which has been disproved times and times again in the last decade. However, despite the lack of scientific support for this theory, rapid onset gender dysphoria was rapidly espoused by the growing gender critical movement as a major talking point, being discussed at large by its spokespeople like J.K. Rowling and in the 2020 book Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. The unfounded fear of a hypothetical harm to children that could be done by allowing a medical or even just social transition in the wrong child is used to systematically prevent real transgender children from accessing healthcare they need. This is a point I want to emphasize. This is not only a rhetorical argument or an academic one. Especially in the last few years, these rhetorical roots have turned into practice and policy internationally, including in the UK, with the Independent Review of Gender Identity Services for Children and Young People, commonly known as the CAS Review, which from April 2024 has informed policy and limited young people's access to puberty blockers and hormones. This is why I find it important to look at horror, fear, and specifically the way we look at gender nonconforming and transgender children in horror. I believe that looking at how narratives of childhood have been constructed within these films can help us understand how transgender childhood is understood and weaponized within this culture war. Now, when it comes to gender nonconforming children, specifically, I have found the narratives analyzed to broadly fall within two categories, which I am currently referring to as the trans child as not human and the trans child as rooted in trauma. These categories can sometimes overlap but are fairly distinct. The non human child, quite literally, is some kind of supernatural creature. Two major examples of this would be Glenn/Glenda from Seed of Chucky and following Chucky installments, and Eli from Let There I One In. In these cases, their non-human nature serves to justify their gender nonconformity. They lack a gender because they lack humanity. In these cases, the child's body is stuck at a prepubescent stage, further connecting this gender nonconformity with their inhumanity. More often, however, children appear in these films through flashbacks or otherwise retellings of the past. They might not be shown as children, but otherwise they have the childhood honed narrative through flashbacks or retellings. These are the cases I consider the trans child as rooted in trauma. There is a variety of different ways this might happen, but most commonly it applies to slasher films in which, as we learn, the killer has been induced to murder and to cross-dressing, which the two things are often associated in these stories, by a root childhood trauma. This often takes the form of witnessing a murder or of sexual abuse. In some specific cases, however, it takes the form of being forced into the wrong gender expression, which is to say, a gender expression different from the one culturally associated with the child's assigned gender at birth. I have then isolated this microtrope of a forced transition, and I believe the specific dynamics within it can tell us a lot about cisgender understanding of gender dysphoria and how that might affect transphobic propaganda and legislation. This forced transition narrative comes with some common feature in each case I've currently observed it in. In each of these cases, the child is born a boy and forced by an abusive caretaker to wear dresses and take on a girl's name, social role, persona, including she/her pronouns. This abusive caretaker is always a woman, usually the mother, in line with the broader horror archetype of the monstrous mother. In each of these cases, the forcibly transitioned character is responsible for a string of murders, and the plot of the film hinges on a final reveal of the killer's identity, meaning who the killer is, which character is the killer, but also reveal of the killer's identity, meaning the killer's transness. Something that is very important to know here is the story beat, this part of the reveal, which is characteristic of any mystery, detective stories, slashers, and so on, is also independently a feature of much transgender fiction, or rather fiction featuring transgender characters, even when the story is otherwise not hinged on a mystery. This is what Jack Halberstam calls the rewind in his book In a Queer Time and Place. Halberstam explains that in one mode that we might call the rewind, the transgender character is presented at first as properly gendered, as passing in other words, and as properly located within a linear narrative. Her exposure as transgender constitutes the film's narrative climax and spells out both her own decline and the unraveling of cinematic time. The viewer literally has to rewind the film after the character's exposure in order to reorganize narrative logic in terms of the past. A first case study for this trope, and perhaps the most famous, is Sleepaway Camp. The film follows overall a classic slasher story. As a child, Angela, the main character, is the sole survivor of a boating accident which killed her family. She is then sent to live with her aunt Martha and cousin Richard. Some years later, Angela and Richard are sent to a summer camp. Angela is quite a meek and shy kid. She speaks very little and is constantly picked on by the other kids. It rapidly becomes clear that there is a killer on the loose in the camp who seems to be specifically targeting Angela's bullies. In the climax and final scene of the film, the camp staff finds Angela in the woods, fully naked, cradling the severed head of her latest victim. In Sleepaway Camp, this final scene serves both as a reveal, letting us know Angela is in fact the killer, and as a rewind scene. And I'm gonna play here the clip.
Angela! Are you okay? Angela, can you hear me?
Enjoy living with us so much. Yes, I know you are. As a welcome home present, I bought you such wonderful new clothes. I just hope that Richard doesn't get jealous that I didn't get him anything. Ah, but then he is such a dear. I'm sure that he won't mind. You see, I've always wanted a little girl. But of course, when my husband left, oh, well, that's all water under the bridge, as I always say. Water under the bridge. But it certainly will be a nice little surprise when Richard comes home to find a little girl in the house. Yes, I've always dreamed of a little girl just like you. I mean, we already have a boy, so another one simply would not do. Oh, no, absolutely not. A little girl would be so much nicer, don't you think so, Angela? Such a lovely name. Why, I believe it means angel. Why, yes, I'm sure it does. I know you're going to like that name. Won't you, Peter?
How can God, she's a boy.
This is the very last scene of the film, which then goes to credits. Jurkovic points to this scene as building sympathy in the audience for Angela. As Jurkovic says, the method of rewinding is not uncommon in the representation of transgender biographies, specifically in narratives where gender exposure is a crucial component of the cinematic climax. Even when the transgender fictional subject is represented as a violent and dangerous character, popular culture narratives sanitize the violence by representing the characters as emotionally vulnerable in order to evoke the sympathy of the reader. Now, these may appear to be somewhat a positive reading. After all, the audience is invited to sympathize with the killer. However, the sympathy comes at the very clear cost of associating transness itself and trauma. It evokes sympathy towards the transgender character by pathologizing transness itself and linking it with abuse. This link of transness, especially in children, and abuse is one that is currently being used to justify the rolling back of trans healthcare. As Horton reports in their critique of the CAS report, in 2022, the UK Minister for Health called for clinicians to look for evidence of what has caused children to be trans, citing the CAS review to claim that identifying as trans is likely to be a response of child sex abuse. This link is insidious, it is culturally pervasive, and it is actively dangerous. More so emphasizing the brutal and abusive nature of this forced transition narrative is the rewind scene of my next example, House at the End of the Street. The film follows teenager Alyssa as she and her mother move into a new town. They learn that the house next door was the site of a brutal double murder where a young girl, Carrie Ann, killed her parents and disappeared. Her brother Ryan still lives in the house, entirely isolated. Ryan and Alyssa grow closer, with most of the story focusing on their relationship until Alyssa discovers that in actuality, Ryan's sister Carrie Ann had died in a swing accident long before the murder of Ryan's parents. The parents had been blaming Ryan for the accident that killed Alyssa and abused them for years until he actually murdered them. Since then, Ryan has been kidnapping local girls and keeping them in his basement, trying to replace his dead sister. After a confrontation, Ryan is arrested and institutionalized. It is in this very final scene, as we already know his crime and motives, that a trans rewind scene happens.
Make a wish, Carrie Ann. My name's not Carrie Ann. It's Ryan.
Yes, it is. Your name is Carrie Ann. Your name is Carrie Ann. Your name is Carrie Ann.
And throughout the film, we were already given a backstory explanation for why and how Ryan is committing these murders. The murderer has already been discovered, his motives analyzed. The film has already shown us flashbacks of a traumatic childhood featuring the death of his sister, but also parental abuse, specifically neglect Ryan's parents' use of heroin while the kids are around. This final scene is tacked on to make us further sympathize or otherwise understand the psyche of the killer, painting him as ultimately himself a victim of a monstrous mother, forcing him in feminine clothes and a feminine name as a punishment for the perceived fault of his sister's death. It is worth noting how this very last shot, the mother's voice echoing into the present over a close-up of the killer sitting in a police facility, very directly echoes the final scene of Psycho, arguably the forefather of this broader trend of trans children as rooted in trauma. This film heavily relies on repeat depictions of child abuse as an explanation for the murder, and the abuse itself is far more graphic than in other instances I have analyzed throughout this research. I find it notable how this is the only example in which this earlier forced transition does not then develop into an adult feminine expression. In Angela's case, for example, in later installments of the series, she will have gender reassignment surgery and continue to live on as Angela even when she no longer has to. Ryan instead introduces himself with his birth name and wears clothing aligned with his assigned male gender at birth. In a way, then, seeing him forced to wear girls' clothes growing up is part of this even more graphic or visual violence. We are shown him being forced to do something he will never choose to do independently. This film spells the trauma out more than any predecessor, and while arguably that makes for a worse film, because to be clear, I'm not recommending this film as a watch to anyone, it also helps expose more clearly than before a truth about cis understandings of dysphoria. I argue that this instinctive understanding of the traumatizing potential of being forced to present as the wrong gender is, in fact, a dislocated empathy for the trans experience of gender dysphoria. Even in the narrative details, this trope mirrors quite closely the experience of transgender children. In both Sleepaway Camp and House at the End of the Street, there is a repeated insistence on the parental figure enforcing, even violently, their chosen name for the child against the child's wishes. Aunt Martha sing-songy repeating the name Angela over and over, and Ryan's mother hitting him as he tries to stand up for himself and affirm his real name. This is exactly what Abigail Schreier, in her transphobic manifesto Irreversible Damage, recommends parents do in order to save their daughters from transness. In the chapter What Should We Do for Our Children? What Should We Do for Our Girls? Page 211 to 221. She advises parents to refuse using the child's chosen name and pronouns, as parents should not be participating in the child's indoctrination. She claims to want to protect children from a rushed transition, and yet what she and every other self-proclaimed gender-critical or concerned parent is doing is the same exact act of traumatizing violence as Aunt Martha's, as Ryan's mother, as all of the other parents in these narratives, forcing boys into dresses. The image of a boy in a dress is one that evokes emotional revulsion in the cis viewer, and these narratives provide a moral justification for that revulsion through a family abuse narrative, a connection that, as I mentioned, is pervasive in transphobic rhetoric currently being wielded against trans healthcare. For the cis filmmaker and the assumed cis gaze of the audience, the idea of being forced into the wrong gender expression is a self-evidently painful, traumatic experience, so much that in both cases there is no further explanation, there's no unpacking or expanding upon this reveal or rewind. We just cut to credits. The, again, assumed cis viewer is invited to physically rewind the film and watch it with this new knowledge, with a newfound sympathy for the monster as victim themselves. And yet, none of the stories are actually written with trans people in mind, despite the very real experience of transgender people, and specifically transgender men, having been boys forced to wear dresses. That experience was no less painful, no less traumatic for me or any other transgender man than you can imagine it being for these characters. And yet, this fear of childhood gender transition as related to abuse is counterintuitively helping to further the abuse and medical neglect of trans children, with a practical playbook literally taken word for word from these horror films. Thank you for listening. These are the references that have been used in the talk, and yeah. looking forward to discuss it more in the actual conference